We're only about 1 month away from the start of the Overwatch League. Besides having games to watch as well as teams and players to support, it also means that we get to enjoy the fun that comes with fantasy leagues again. I tried Fantasy Overwatch for the first time last year and it was absolutely amazing. The crew over at DraftBuff have been doing a great job, and for those of you who may not have tried it before, I highly recommend it because it does kind of enhance your overall experience as a fan. If you've ever seen or played like fantasy football, baseball, or basketball, it's basically the same thing but in Overwatch form. But even if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I still do recommend giving it a shot anyway by downloading the app. You get to compete against your friends and the community while drafting your own custom team. Not to mention you could also do it for leagues like CSGO, League of Legends, and even Call of Duty if you're into any of that. To celebrate my partnership with DraftBuff this year, I'm going to be doing a bit of an overview of some of my own personal player rankings for fantasy. We're going to highlight some of the guys I recommend drafting, maybe a few that I don't, and a few sleeper picks as well. Before I do this though, it's very important to keep in mind how earning points works, especially if you're new to this thing. So keep in mind that it is very stat driven. Things like eliminations, final blows, healing, and deaths matter a lot. In other words, the people who pad the stat sheets are usually the ones you generally want to pursue. That's why flex support, off-tank, and DPS are the best players to draft. They're the most likely ones to put up the big numbers you're looking for. If you look at player rankings, no matter what the platform is, those are usually the guys who fill out the top spots. That is why my number one player to draft in 2021 is Violet. If you have the number one pick in your draft or he is still available by the time it's your pick, just get him, don't even hesitate. Violet is easily one of the most reliable point sources in the league. The ridiculous kill participation on characters like Zen, Baptiste, and Moira, plus the insane healing rate makes him a top choice. He averaged a ludicrous 118 points per week in 2020, and he only got better as the season progressed. Violet is playing at the top of his game right now, and he's arguably the best support player in the world. Even with Twilight being on the team, it's still worth making him of high priority. Speaking of high priority, let's talk about Alarm, aka my number 2 support available. He's basically the same as Violet, high fragging, good healing, and great general overall contribution. He frags a little less than Violet, but in return he does die less, so it does kind of even out a bit. Alarm is literally right there with him, it's very close, they're basically neck and neck. And if you didn't know, he actually averaged the most points per week in 2020 among all active starters, and it's worth assuming he has the chance to do it again. Moving a little bit downward on my support list, some people may be a little bit surprised to know that I have Jonak at my number 4 spot among all supports and 12th overall in the draft. Because believe it or not, I'm expecting Jonak to have an up year. Averaging 94 points in 2020, that's pretty acceptable, but I feel he's capable of outputting some even stronger performances now that the team around him has changed a ton. As the only remaining member of that original roster, the NYXL are showing they want to build more around Jonak for the foreseeable future. The previous time New York primarily played around him, Jonak won League MVP with his high mechanical prowess and ability to get picks on Zenyatta. Another season of that caliber very well could be on the way because Zenyatta Brigitte is one of the more popular support compositions to run, and I'm expecting the NYXL to embrace it whenever they can. The NYXL made some major changes, but I think it will be worth it for Jonak. They lacked a true identity and direction last year, but now they retooled and rebuilt to potentially avoid that, and I think Jonak just might be worth it because of this. Another guy you might want to be on the lookout for is Fielder. Last year, he exploded onto the scene with his heroics on high ping, and somehow he managed to average the 8th highest number of points in fantasy, and if you get rid of the inactive players, he's suddenly top 5. This year, he's going to be playing without any connection disadvantages at all. If he can make big plays at a disadvantage, it is terrifying to think about what he could end up doing on equal footing, and he gets to be part of a very similar system to last year, being under the same coaching and all. A year improved with more fair circumstances could mean major point potential, and he's somebody you definitely do not want to miss out on if you're looking to scoop up a flex support in those first couple of rounds. But how about we move down the list a bit more? What about some of the potential underrated pickups? Well, for those of you who are new to fantasy, you definitely got to consider Crimzo, because I actually have him ranked 26th. I know it might sound ridiculous considering he is nowhere near top tier, but please, hear me out. Believe it or not, but he averaged the second most fantasy points per week, only trailing Alarm. This is a prime example of stats playing a huge role in this thing. Most people would call Crimzo a mid-tier support at best, right? But his fantasy production is unreal. Not only is he usually top 10 in healing on whatever character he's playing, but he manages to net some of the highest eliminations among all support players. If there's one place where Crimzo can be fully appreciated, it's fantasy. He might not be worth using your first pick on considering he's on a new team and under a new system and all, but I would highly consider choosing him if you're trying to round out who you potentially start at support on a week-to-week basis. Crimzo is a viable fantasy option. Please give him a chance because he might just surprise you. My other sleeper pick at support is going to be Kariv. I have him ranked 46th overall. Kariv had a down year playing for the Defiant in 2020. He really didn't get much of a chance to show off the heroics like he did in 2019 for the Valiant. But even so, he was actually a consistent fantasy option each week. Kariv's fantasy production could be even higher now that he has access to better resources. He's got better DPS to make more plays, and his level of protection is going to be far better thanks to Krong. Call him washed or not what he used to be if you'd like, but he's still a star in the fantasy world. He averaged more points than some of the big name players like Jonak, Sparkle, Striker, and Carpe. Much like Crimzo, I would highly recommend getting him as a potential starter or somebody you can utilize off the bench. I wouldn't pick him early on, but make sure to keep him in mind as you reach the mid to late rounds of your draft. Now for a few guys I would recommend staying away from. As a general rule of thumb, I recommend avoiding main supports in the league until the flex support position starts to bottom out a little bit. With the exception of a few of the top players, most main supports earn average or below average points on a weekly basis. That's just the nature of this position sadly. Less kill contribution and less heals compared to flex support. So with that said, you really want to avoid the main supports who are on low or even mid-tier teams a lot of the time. Main supports on a struggling or inconsistent team are going to get so many deaths and have even less eliminations than the average main support would. Even in 10-player leagues, you gotta avoid the low and mid-tier main supports. Please do it. If flex support is looking a little dry, I recommend trying to go for those aggressive main supports on the top tier teams. Guys like Lee J. Gone, FD God, and Funny Astro are really good choices. They all usually got above average scores last year because they had that hyper aggressive style. They're getting enough kills and healing to have an impact in fantasy. They were the only 3 main supports to average 90 or more points last year. Keep that in mind. Nobody else really even came close. So again, if you really need another decent support option, but flex support is not looking too hot, consider one of those guys. Now let's take a dive into DPS, aka the most oversaturated position in professional Overwatch. There are countless good options because there's just so many to choose from. With every team having 3 or more on their roster, you are bound to find some good options at the early, mid, and even late stages of your draft. Let's go over some of my top picks that are hard to go wrong with. My number 1 ranked DPS coming into the season is Decay. This year feels like it's going to be completely and utterly dominated by him. We already saw what he could do on a mediocre Dallas team, and we got a sneak peek of how impactful he could be for Washington during their playoff run. Decay has finally found his home as far as I'm concerned, and I'm expecting that to reflect upon his gameplay. And right now is truly his time to shine. Tracer has such major prevalence in the meta as well as some of the sniper characters, so you would expect him to dominate with regularity. He should be the main playmaker who puts in the work on a variety of DPS heroes, and he also has shown he can flex on Zarya, which makes him a high value flex option who can earn big points in a multitude of metas. Usually it is a good idea to look at flex support first, but I truly do think Decay is an exception to this rule. If he's still there after the first pick or two, it might be worth it to snag him. Only Fleta and Birdring earned more points per week last year during the regular season, and they played on better teams. Just imagine what he can do now that the Justice are looking dangerous. He's a big-name playmaker who's going to be in the lineup probably 95% of the time, you'd have to imagine, or even more. I know Decay's moved on from multiple teams in the past and all, but I get the feeling this year is going to be different and he'll be happy. Oh, and speaking of Birdring and Fleta, those are my other top DPS players on the board. Fleta's high ranking is pretty obvious, I would say. He's literally the reigning MVP of the league. He boasts one of the most diverse and flexible hero pools among all DPS in the league, making him viable in basically any meta that comes the league's way. With the supporting cast around him remaining mostly the same, Fleta should be able to continue taking over games on a regular basis. Looking at Birdring, his potential is just as high as Fleta's. As the primary playmaker of the Gladiators, he is a great number 1 #1 option. His prowess on Widowmaker, Hanzo, and Ashe makes him a dominant force in any meta involving snipers. And as we all know, he's got the Junkrat, McCree, and Sombra locked and loaded if needed. Leading the lobby in kills and leading in fantasy points should continue to be the norm for this incredible player. Fleta and Birdring are must picks. They were both outputting an absurd 104 points per week in 2020, which is insanely good for a DPS player. Most of the top point earners last year were either flex supports or off tanks. They're usually the ones averaging 100 or more points a week. So that seriously speaks volumes about the value somebody like Fleta or Birdring brings to the table. Alright, but what about some of the guys I recommend not sleeping on? Well, for one, I highly recommend giving Glister a shot. I have him ranked 9th among all DPS players and 15th overall. On London, he only averaged a minimal 70 points per week. The fact that he's not as popular as some of the other DPS in the game could make people forget about him in your draft. These two factors could be seen as a major turnoff, which could be really good for you. I mean, a tremendous benefit. The star power is clearly present within Glister. His talents and elite sniping abilities were put to waste on a struggling London team. Now as a member of the San Francisco Shock, Glister should have more chances to dominate the competition. No more having to worry about a mediocre team holding him back. He has way better teammates backing him up and superior coaching, which in all likelihood will see him elevate to the next level. If the Shock were able to turn Ons into the best hitscan player in the game, think about what's possible with a more established player like Glister. He's a sleeper pick who could sneakily become one of the top point earners at the DPS position. Alright, but some of you are probably saying, but ATP, what about more of an on the down low sleeper pick who isn't that popular? Don't worry, I got you. Here's two. After you get a few of your first core pieces, consider going for either Guangboon of the alexyOWL or Mai-Kei Lee of the Guangzhou Charge. I have them both in my top 30 among all DPS players in the draft. They're both in a pretty similar boat, I would say. They are these high-talent hitscan prospects coming out of Chinese contenders who don't get that much attention from a casual standpoint. Mai-Kei Lee, he actually comes from the Sparks Academy team, but I feel that most people probably won't think much of that because they don't care for Chinese contenders. I would venture to say it's probably the second least popular region of contenders among the Western audience, with only Australia doing worse. So with that said, it's almost guaranteed that some people are going to turn a blind eye to him in the draft. Use that to your advantage, my friends. Think about it like this. Mai-Kei Lee is the sole replacement for Happy. The fact that the Charge trust him to be enough compensation on his own to make up for that level of play is a testament to how dangerous he could be. Meanwhile, Guangboon is arguably the best sniper on the NYXL this year. He's surely going to make for a nice 1-2 punch alongside Ivy, and what's great, and I think what makes him even more valuable than Mai-Kei Lee in a way, is the fact that he comes from an even lesser known team. Team Cat and Chinese contenders basically did nothing, so not a lot of people are going to realize who they are. They're not going to be talking about them, looking at their gameplay. So you could really use that to your advantage and get a very high value pick out of somebody you might be able to get away with drafting in the mid to late rounds. Now let's go over a few players I maybe recommend taking a pass on, at least until they show they're a bit more reliable in the fantasy department. For one, I'd be careful with Doha this year. Despite being a really good fantasy option in 2020, he now is going to be splitting playtime with Sparkle and Exy, so his production is definitely going to be taking a hit. Sparkle, I would say he's better at most of the same heroes that Doha is known for, outside of like Sombra, Mei, or maybe Echo, so he's going to see less time for sure. He's becoming more of a niche flex option on paper, sadly. I would also be careful with the Spark DPS players this year. As good as Architect and Godsby sound on paper as a starting lineup, they might not always be in, sadly, because guys like Shy and Sominsu, they're total mystery factors. We have no idea what they're going to end up bringing to the table, or how much they could end up playing for that matter. It really could depend on the synergy thanks to the Spark wanting to go part Chinese and part Korean this year. So please, take these guys at your own risk, because you never know who could end up playing over who with this type of system they're running. Now to wrap it up with some tanks. My #1 tank and 3rd overall selection on the board is Void. I know he's not as flashy or glamorous as a big name flex support or DPS, but he gets the job done. Waiting on a flex support or big DPS just might be worth it with him, especially if some of the top tier options are already off the board by your pick. I've stated my stance on how insane Void is time after time over this last year or so. You guys know the stats as well as I do at this point. The least amount of deaths among all off-tanks, plus the most eliminations among all players in 2020 didn't just lead to a successful season for the Shanghai Dragons. Anybody who picked this guy up on their fantasy team benefited as well. At an astounding 108 points per week, he was averaging more than Birdring, Decay, Fleta, and even Gangnam Jin, who was one of the top-earning flex supports of 2020. Again, much like with Crimzo, you gotta think outside of the box when it comes to who's the most attractive to watch. Think about the stats. Void is a machine for this type of thing, and I promise you won't regret picking him in the early rounds of your draft. My other top dog at tank this year is Hanbin, who is in a very similar place to Void because he actually averaged the same number of points as Void last year and was second among all off-tanks in eliminations. What's absolutely crazy is that he actually played an hour less and yet still almost had the greater stats. Given that he was a top of the leaderboard type of guy for every single off-tank hero per 10, it goes without saying that Hanbin is a fantastic option regardless of the meta thanks to his playstyle. He is somebody who is quick to apply the pressure, which means that he's likely to put up big stat lines every single week. With an even stronger tank partner in Fearless lining up next to him this year, Hanbin has the potential to post the same ludicrous numbers as last year, if not even better. With the exception of Krong, who I highly recommend drafting as well, most of the top earning off tanks likely are going to be the ones constantly taking matters into their own hands. So people like Gargoyle, Choi Yobin, Fury, and Space, those are the players you want to prioritize first when it comes to the draft order of tanks, along with Krong, who is a special exception to this rule. But what if you're looking for more of a sleeper pick to get in either the mid or late rounds of a draft? Well, one player at least for the mid round would be Poco. I have him ranked 9th among all tank players. Before Fury took the starting job away from him last year, Poco outputted multiple 100-point weeks. When he actually gets the chance to play for the entire series, he usually ends up being a solid contributor, and with D.Va and Zarya having at least some relevance currently in the meta, you should expect Poco to post some of those good numbers yet again. And this time there is nobody standing in Poco's way. He is one of the only 2 tank players on this roster, so playtime is guaranteed currently. If you're looking to get a second tank player or maybe a third depending on the situation, Poco could be a reliable source. And due to him not being the big popular star he used to be back in Season 1, you could end up getting some high value out of him without having to go through the trouble of selecting him early. But what about main tanks, you may be saying? Are there any good ones to pick out there? Well, yes, it's hard to go wrong with Smurf because he's all around insane statistically. You could also go with Fearless or Sottle for their hyper-aggressive playstyles. These are all the guys who die less than average on main tank, but also make more plays as well. But I would also consider Mono this year. He's maybe a bit more passive than the rest of the lot, but this year might end up being different. While still a great player last year, Mono's lack of resources hindered his true carry potential on the NYXL. After seeing how much Sada was invested into last year, it's worth assuming Mono could get a similar treatment on Philadelphia. He won't have to worry about supports not helping him enough. He's in fantastic hands here with Funny Astro and Alarm. Being traded to the Fusion may be the best thing to ever happen to him both for his career and in fantasy. A major year could be in store for this multi-year veteran. A word of warning though, much like with main support, main tank is a position you have to be very careful with. That's why I recommend either avoiding most of them or holding off on a main tank until the later rounds of a draft if you can. Main tank tends to see less high point earners than off tank due to the nature of the position. They get hard focused so often so they can't really contribute in the kill department the same way off tanks can. And because they are often the ones getting shot down, their death totals make them even less appealing. Like I said before, there are some great options, but there's also some not so great ones. Main tanks from the top teams are the way to go. Those on the rather inconsistent teams probably aren't worth your time, even the somewhat decent teams. But you also have to be cautious with some of the off tanks in the league. Not as much as main tank, but still, keep an eye out. A few guys I'm on the fence about are Bernard and League. They're both insane players, but that's kind of the problem. Because they're both insane, we have no idea who the Spark would end up rather playing. For that reason alone, I actually have them ranked 14th and 15th among all tanks. While they both feel like potential superstars in the making, you want to hold off on them until you get some other people with guaranteed playtime. Fill some of the other positions and come back to them later if you still want them that badly. It's not worth taking the risk early on unless you know for a fact what the Spark are doing, if you're some sort of insider, I guess. If you want an example of a guaranteed to start off tank that I would probably be careful with, I would go with Michelle. I want to remain optimistic that he can turn his career around, but that does not change the fact that we haven't seen him play consistently in over a year. Regardless of what he did in the past, that makes him a big gamble. That's why I have him ranked as the number 20 tank player in the draft. If it's between him and one of the better main tank options, you might be better off going with the main tank. But yeah, that's basically everything I have for you in this video. That's going to wrap up my little fantasy rankings recap video, if you will. I am by no means an expert, but I really do hope that you found some of these rankings insightful, and I'm curious what all of you think down in the comments below. Let me know what players you'll be looking out for when you draft this year. By the way, I also have some more fantasy-related videos coming very soon, so if you enjoyed this initial one, there's definitely more on the way to look forward to. I'm super excited to continue my partnership with DraftBuff, and I hope you guys will be too. Lots of fun stuff is being planned, so you gotta stay tuned. But until then, I wanted to thank all of you for watching this video. I really appreciate your support a lot, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.